Welcome to the FRCL Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
Hey, hi everybody. It is May 6th of 2026, and we are Fedora, RHEL, and CentOS leads here to talk about a problem that is particularly being experienced in the Fedora community, and that is a build infrastructure shortage. So this is FRCL 36 in the in Jira. I'll drop a link into the chat, and this was filed by Neil, although I think this is not a Neil problem. This is Neil as a member of the Fedora Council saying, hey, we've got an issue. And this has been a thing that we've talked about. Just like I remember a couple of years ago at DevConf CZ, we were in, Red Hat was in the middle of its CapEx planning, and I posed the question in kind of an open forum there. I said, hey, we're buying hardware. What do people need? Like we're doing CapEx planning. And somebody said, we need new Z. And then everybody laughed. And because of cynicism, that could actually be possible. So today we're going to talk about what the problems actually are, what we're doing about them, and when we can expect new things. So I'm joined by Josh Miller, who is involved in some of the solutions, and also midway between that DevConf CZ experience and today's conversation, I convinced Fabio to file a ticket about some of the problems that we're having, and I think that is good material to draw from. So with all that in mind, Neil, do you want to talk to the overall issue that you're seeing, and we'll start there?
Well, I mean, I feel like I kind of described this fairly well in the ticket. It's basically, I mean, the most recent problem we have right now is definitely around S390X, but it isn't the first time that we've had this problem. It isn't even the first architecture where we've had this problem. I've been around long enough to see that we go through waves of this over and over again. And what it feels like I've observed is we don't, as part of Fedora infrastructure stuff, and again, this is just me poking around and looking at the different stuff, looking at the Ansible, looking at the way we do metrics and whatever, looking at the Knox stuff that's available on the outside of the Red Hat firewall. We don't actually track performance for contributor experience. There are no KPIs related to that. There are no metrics related to it. And that, to me, feels like a pretty bad misstep. I think that's the underlying root cause for why this keeps happening over and over again as we get into new architectures, we get into new platforms, as more and more demands are put on the infrastructure. People within the contributor community feel like it doesn't actually matter how their experience goes because it doesn't seem to translate into outcomes or action to improve it. I think in the last couple of years, I think Fabio has a little bit more direct experience than I do because he's been more willing to say something about it. And also he's more disproportionately impacted. It results in, you know, the outcome that typically happens is, well, let's go talk about, can we do some like short-term bodge up to do something about it? What it doesn't translate into, all right, we've got X number of short-term bodge ups. What are we doing to make it so bodge ups aren't needed in the future? What are we measuring latency or time to live, time to build, time to release, time to tag? And are there trend lines that we can observe that indicate that the stress level for contributors to be successful within Fedora, are those trend lines going in a positive direction rather than a negative one? Do we see those things going? And like, I compare this to what I've seen when I was working in at a previous employer where I wasn't responsible for this stuff. And we had things with Datadog where we measured our stuff and we tracked build tasks, we tracked time to live, we tracked latency of release and all these other things. With OpenSUSE, where their build system, they have a whole Grafana dashboard that tracks many of these types of metrics around what is the success reasons, the success cases, the build causes, failures, which architectures are screaming more or less, these sorts of things. And in a way that when someone who is like, let's say Brendan, as Mr. Manager guy involved of all this stuff, you know, someone goes and complains and says like, hey, this is a problem. Mr. Manager guy Brendan can go look at the pretty charts and say, oh yeah, I can observe that there is a definite decrease in the quality of life for people. And as a consequence, when I come around to go to my Mr. Manager boss and say, I need to prioritize an expansion of resources, whether that is in Fedora, whether that is in CentOS CBS, whether that's for ELN, or whether that's for a new architecture, whether that means going to IBM and saying, hey, we need to rent another mainframe because we don't have enough. Or, you know, the upcoming worrisome future is we're bringing on RISC-V. And with RISC-V, we need to be cognizant of that because we have to figure out, okay, do we need a more mix of emulated builders? Do we need to prioritize native builders? Do we need to go start talking to third-party partners to figure out, you know, how do we add excess capacity, add more capacity? How do we splinter it? How do we need to do the balance of builders? Do we need more large, more small? Like, we don't seem to have, at least again from me, looking at the stuff, we don't have a way of being able to answer those questions in a way that translates into businessy objectives that translate back into improvements in the experience for Fedora contributors. So that's the outlay of this.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it would be fair to say that we have spent more time on prioritizing equipment purchases based on warranty expirations and vibes than on metrics. So metrics development seems like a very valuable thing for us to pursue. Tomasz, your hand's been up for a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily entirely vibe based, but yeah, like Neil has a really very valid point, and that is we are not really collecting this kind of metrics. And I would love, Neil, if you can just point me to the dashboard of SUSE or comment on the ticket that we are discussing, mention the set of metrics that you would like us to see, because the main reason why we are not monitoring those is that the monitoring infrastructure was based on Agios kind of old. We are on Zabbix now, so we can enable new, it's way simpler for infrastructure and for other contributors to contribute new templates to monitor new stuff. So let's do that. Like we don't have those numbers, and it will be very valuable to have them.
Right. So carrying on from that, I think it would be fair to say that most of the metrics that we're thinking about from a manager perspective right now is how are we handling the issues that are showing up? How are we prioritizing work and whatnot? And this is a different class of measurement. I'm curious for anyone who can comment. Have we historically had any like 5-10 years ago? Have we had anything that's monitoring things like build time and wait times and that sort of thing? Because like my experience has mostly been, oh, this one is the slowest. Is it like unforgivably slow? Like S390 right now feels kind of unforgivably slow. Do we have anything there that we've done before? Or are we really talking about new territory, even though this is like kind of well-established practice in the industry? There are a lot of people in the text right now.
I don't think we ever collected like any meaningful stats. Like from my days at RHEL, I can tell you that release engineering is monitoring the time that it takes to compose things, because that's a good indication. But there is no real record as we can go and draw out dashboard from. That's why. Thanks, Neil, for the link. I'll look into the metrics that we can actually collect and maybe do something about it.
Yeah. So I guess the other question that's on my mind is this exclusive to Fedora, or CentOS leads? Are you having equipment shortfalls? Yakov, you're right in the middle. How are things for you?
So the biggest issue we're dealing with builders right now is getting newer builders in order to be ready for a higher baseline for IBM architectures in RHEL 11. So IBM wants to have they want to set the compiler baselines to be one higher for RHEL 11, and in order to do that, we have to have builders that support that. So we need Power 10s. The big weakness in this whole thing has been that Stream Koji only has Power 9, where we need to have Power 10. So I believe there are efforts ongoing to procure a Power 10 for that purpose. Or one or more, I guess. However that works, I'm not directly involved in the purchasing, but that I know is an issue. And of course, we're all on the same S390, and we're all having the same S390 problems as everybody's today, because we're all on the same mainframe. So that's obviously not great.
Okay, so it seems like this is mostly a Fedora issue at this point in time. That's my read. And so here's what's especially interesting to me, I should say, is that we're having the conversation here as opposed to just like in a Fedora-centric space. Why is that? Like, is this not something that would come up in an infrastructure meeting?
Well, I think that the goal is to raise it to sort of the next level higher, because RISC-V is coming soon to a builder near you. The decisions that are made on RISC-V builders for Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL all need to be in sync. We should have similar types and ideas of what our build baseline looks like for these soon to be onboarded architectures. As if we do one thing for Fedora and a totally different thing for CentOS, and yet a third different thing for RHEL, that's going to both create support cost, and then when it comes time to add new builders, it's going to be harder to make a bulk purchase.
Yeah, but it's the same team that would be buying the equipment for all three, right? Well, okay, so true fact, it's the same team that would be buying equipment for all three. Like we're all joined at the hip here. So I'm not so worried about that, because the discipline that goes into scoping equipment for Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL is, it's going to be practiced there. And in fact, one of the reasons why we are not like pushing forward a RISC-V primary architecture right now is that the equipment that we think we would want to be able to maintain and provide a standard of service it's just not commercially available at this point. Troy.
I want some clarification on that. You were talking about just the RISC-V, correct? As about it being the same team.
Yeah,
because it seems like getting the Power 10 has been talking to three different heads. You're talking about RISC-V only.
Specifically RISC-V.
Okay, because yes, that is correct. I'm in touch with those. So yes, I just wanted clarification on that, because if that was the same team for Power 10, I'm like, wow, then who's all these people I've been talking to?
Yeah, no, I think the reality for something like RISC-V is that it's not who you're talking to, it's what date you're having the conversation, because what is going to look viable in May is different than the conversation you're going to have in June. That's different than the conversation you'll have in July. There's a lot of vaporware out there, and there's a lot of any day now kind of conversations, and every once in a while these things actually come true, but mostly what they come with is an incremental deadline or due date. For S390 though, I think we have got a couple people here that that ultimately, no matter who you're talking to, it's ultimately making it to them, and me for that matter. Yeah, and Yakov just pointed out in the chat that this is like ARIT64. It is exactly like ARIT64. Lots of enthusiasm. Half of the things work out, and then half of the things that work out end up consolidating in some way. Yeah, Neil, RMV6 and 7, well, 7 anyway. Okay, so yeah, Neil, go ahead.
So, sorry, I am juggling 2 video call meetings, which is super not fun right now. But basically, I feel like when I felt like this felt like it was always kind of possible for us to be actively measuring these things. Like I talked to Mike McLean about this, and he's like, yeah, you could totally do this. It's the instrumentation's there, the data is there, just nobody ever did it. So and when I went to go talk at scale about our S390X problems to the S390X OSPO lady, Elizabeth Joseph, who was there, the thing that I guess should not have surprised me, but still did, was that the Fedora representative for her did not tell her we were struggling with S390X. I was the first person ever to tell her that there is a problem, which is worrying because we have known that there is a problem for over 2 years. That is kind of why this is now a systemic, scary problem to me, because the people who can give us more mainframes don't know we have a problem. And that's not good. And yeah, like I don't actually have that much else to contribute to this discussion other than to say, like, I went and talked to a bunch of people across the different communities and ecosystems about how they're dealing with this and how Fedora communicates with them. And the answer I kept getting was, Fedora talks to us, which is a very, very bad question, which is a very, very bad question for me to get as a response. So I don't know what we are or are not doing, but whatever it is needs to change. That's pretty much all I got.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say that we haven't had effective plumbing here. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately we can get more mainframes. If you're talking about within the RHEL infrastructure, within the data centers, but IT controls it now, right? The issue right now is that the 4 that are currently in there are not compliant, and IT is not going to take any more. We could throw them 5 mainframes right now, and they would not accept any of them because we lost our IT guys 2 years ago that maintained those systems. So the negotiations with IBM on the cost of maintaining the current 4 is really the holdup. I could walk a mainframe in there right now and they wouldn't plug it up. So there are negotiations going for new mainframes and stuff like that, but until IT and development on our side and IBM side negotiate the cost to maintain the current 4, we're not going to move anywhere.
So does that mean that we should consider S390X effectively intractable for the time being? Like, essentially, all problems with it are unsolvable?
I don't think so. I think it's more like we're at the beginning of a get well plan.
Yeah, I think we're at the beginning of a get well plan, but I also think that we need to be able to say I'm continuing to tell IBM you are broken. And don't be surprised if I tell you you are broke. I come to you and say this build did not happen because you're broken and you've been broken for a long time. So, builds are supposed to happen, within hours at the most. But we're talking days now with your S390, and sometimes, you're dropping off with your builds. I don't know why you guys are, I don't know why IBM's surprised that I'm coming back to them and saying, I can't do this for you right now. You guys should have maintainers that are watching this stuff. You should have other things in place that you're actually watching the community yourself. So I don't know why I'm doing an end around to tell you this stuff. So I believe that we should be bringing things up as much as possible. And you can bring them to me, definitely. And I'll go to IBM and say, hey, another thing broken, another thing broken, another thing broken. Infrastructure-wise, I know that's there. Builds that fail, especially down in the Fedora, if we're, behind on something even bigger, I'd like to know, because I talked to IBM and, they've been moving because over the years they've started to embrace RHEL more, embrace CentOS. They're moving their development away from Ubuntu and into Fedora. So their development group is reliant on Fedora on the S390. It is. So if that's broken, then go ahead.
So let me give you an example of something that I don't think would ordinarily come up in the normal conversations. I've actually held off on doing an FFmpeg upgrade in Fedora and EPEL, even though I could have done it all the way back in March. Like there is a major version bump. It requires going through all the reverse dependencies and building them. I am dreading it, not because the code changes, because the code changes are basically zero. It's not significant. I am dreading it because it will take me 3 weeks to do it because of the build time problems. And again, it is not just S390X. S390X happens to be the sharpest, most acute problem. It's to some degree every architecture except for x86-64. But the thing is that the amount of pain is amplified for every architecture that sucks. And I know I have to do this work, but I don't want to. And I think what we're going to start seeing is more of that. And we don't want to be in a situation where more people feel like that, which means that data never bubbles up because people just go into helplessness mode, learn helplessness, and then they just stop. And then if they just stop, then things look fine, but they are not, right? The illusory fine is what I'm really worried about.
Okay, so I just have a quick question. I am under the impression that we have excess capacity for x86, Power 10, and ARC64. If that is not what people's experience is, that might mean that we don't have things deployed effectively, or that might mean that we just need to alter resource allocation some. And when I say we, I specifically mean Fedora, because we're still doing CentOS stream stuff. Pat, go ahead.
And I hate to hard specific, but in my experience, there's about a 30 to 45 minute wait time for ARC64 build nodes. And I don't know if that's within your acceptable window. Unlike
that
Neil,
is not an acceptable window.
Yeah, I build 2 or 3 packages a month. So I basically just fire off Koji build and go do something else and check on it later in the day.
Kevin.
Okay, I can't stay quiet anymore. So I'm well aware of the S390 issues, and yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking the topic was. But I am completely unaware of any issues on x86-64, ARC64, and Power 10. No one has reported any issues with them. So it is incredibly frustrating to me when people like get really mad about a problem that was never actually reported, and I don't even know that it exists. We have excess capacity on all those. As far as I know, I've watched loads. On power, there is some memory contention, a little bit of memory contention, but it easily keeps up with everything else. S390 is by far the most problem reporting thing, and people have reported problems on that, and people have filed a ticket. Thank you for that, so we could track things. But I am unaware of any of those, and I'm very interested to hear the problems. If you could file a ticket when you see an excessive build time, so that it can actually be data that matches up to a specific time, I can actually look into it and figure out what's going on. So yeah, I'm completely unaware of any other architectures. We did have problems with power when we had Power 9, but when we moved to the Power 10s, that all seemed to have gone away. I've not noticed backlogs there. I've not noticed builds taking a while. I'm really surprised with the Arch64. We have a lot of capacity there. It's very close to x86-64 levels of capacity on there. So that is very surprising to me. But anyway, report your problems, please, please, I beg of you.
Yes, if Kevin is surprised, something has gone terribly wrong. Like, remember, we just moved data centers, and the way we moved data centers was by buying millions and millions of dollars of equipment to retire old systems. We have extra capacity, and if you're not experiencing that day to day, at least on the Fedora side, because we're still doing CentOS work. This is a thing that is surprising to us, and like per Kevin, please file issues, but also per Neil, we should have metrics that discover this so that people don't have to file issues because we get notified, right? I think that's a very valid thing that we should pursue as a follow-up here, is to make it so that we don't rely on people to notice and feel that it is worth their time to file issues, because at least with S390, we know that people are like, why bother? It won't change. But the issue that Fabio filed, actually, it has helped move things along for us internally. So it is worthwhile, but it's worthwhile in geologic time. Yakov, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that the last year's data center improvement definitely was a huge improvement. I noticed it right away. One of the other projects I'm involved with is for our flat packs, where we leave out S390 entirely, so we're not dealing with that backlog. There, I do see that still not as bad as it was during the Power 9s, but even with the Power 10s, it does seem like the power builds take a little bit longer than Arch and x86. I don't know what the expectation should be. I don't know that it's a queue so much. It just seems like it's still a slower architecture at the end of the day. I don't know. I'm not sure maybe what the expectation should be. Should I expect those to take longer? Should those really not be taking longer? And if they are, it's a problem. It's not as bad as it was, but it's still my slowest architecture of if I leave S390X out, or which we do for flatpaks, it's still the slowest of the remaining three. So what is the expectation there?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I think Neil said in the chat, like, there's a cultural thing going on, and if we don't have the metrics, users just stop being squeaky wheels because the expectations just sort of degrade in terms of service performance. And that's a cultural thing. We have to have the metrics to get to this. I've seen this in other like service orgs, right? And there may be a hidden problem that we aren't seeing, and we're only going to see in the statistics because it shows up in the build times, but it's not showing up in the capacity metrics that we're actually watching. So,
yeah. So I think this goes back to Neil's learned helplessness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a boil the frog thing. It's like it's a slow degradation, and so people just get used to it. You get used to it, and then it's just really bad.
Yeah,
statistically, sometimes.
I mean, it's an easier outcome for most people, especially if they're not paid to deal with it, right? Like, part of the reason that I'm even complaining is at this level is because Brendan keeps insisting it will do something. So I went and did it. Like a long time ago, I used to report these things, and nothing ever came out of it in a positive direction. So I stopped. And I think a lot of other people have felt similarly about it. So that's like, and that's why I explicitly made this ticket that prompted this discussion about the systemic issue and not the individual one. The individual one doesn't actually matter because we can fix it eventually. I mean, honestly, the worst case scenario is we just pull the plug on S390X and say Fedora, ELN, and everything just doesn't have it anymore. RHEL is just going to have to deal with it themselves and suffer, right? I don't care about S390X enough to advocate for any other solution. But what I worry about is that more community interesting architectures are going to have the same problems. And we've had them before too. And it's just not worth it to go through that treadmill over and over again and continue to degrade. So what I'd like to see is, how do we get towards metrics? Can we have a fancy dashboard like the OpenSUSE people do that any person can look at and understand the performance of the build system? That's the sort of thing I want to see. That would be the nice outcome.
Yeah. So Yakov just posted some interesting stats in the chat. So for the recording, building Chromium x86-64 takes 1 hour and 43 minutes, AR64 3 hours 8 minutes, Power Old Indian 7 hours 26 minutes. So maybe this is an indication that we need to adjust the size of VirtHost. Like, I think the ideal would be that all of our builds complete at about the same time, and that we would provision for that. You can't exactly do that, but yeah. And Kevin's pointing out that that's a VM for Power 10 and bare metal for the first two. So to the extent that we can make these things equal, maybe that means we need to have fewer Power 10 builders, but have them be beefier or something. When we were doing ARM v7 work, we actually ended up having the 32-bit ARM builders do mass rebuilds faster than everything else, just because there were so many of them, even though like individual packages were slower. So it's the math is a little variable, like what you optimize for. But I think the point that we don't have stats that we're running, and so we don't have alarms other than people raising issues, is definitely probably the most important takeaway we can come out of this one with, unless we can give Josh more ammo for advancing S390.
I mean, and the bigger thing is that more and more things are being done on the Fedora build farm. We've got Fedora CI, we've got Packet, we've got upstream testing, we've got even the CentOS stuff running on it, which is a whole nother bottle of crazy that I don't want to unpack right now. But like, when you have all this other stuff going on, leveraging the Fedora build farm for a farm that was actually sized primarily for human interacted invoked builds, we're drastically undersized across the board. We just don't have any visibility to prove it on a systemic level, and that's where I hope we can get towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because like in the I think one of our goals here, like FRCL as a body, is to identify systemic problems that we have not been able to solve on our own, like within any one community, and we have a backlog of those, which is why we have a lot of things to complain about here. But you know, it pains me to say that you're right, but you're totally right. We need to have metrics. We need the data.
I would just like to see something starting to show up before we start onboarding RISC-V. Like, RISC-V scares me a lot more because it is a lot weaker. The build performance across the builders are more inconsistent. Like, I've talked to Jonathan in Alma Linux. I talked to Troy from the CentOS stream. And like, I observe the stuff that goes on in the Fedora RISC-V Koji, right? The performance across all three systems differs so wildly, my head spins. Like, this is something that, like, it won't really even out unless we know what we need to do to make it even out in a positive direction. And so having those, thinking about metrics, thinking about, how do we track time to live? How do we track time to completion, time to failure, time to tracking, time to reporting, all these other things. I think that's gonna give us a good way to start thinking about how our systems architecture should be evolving, right? Whether we keep using Koji, maybe I decide I'm crazy enough to go do the straw man proposal of trying out OBS, or someone attempts to conflux it up. Like, all of these different things require this understanding to evaluate them properly, or otherwise it's all just vibes and failures in the end. And I especially mean the failures. You are not going to have a success case without knowing what success should look like.
Okay, so question for the room here. Is there, because we're having this conversation, because we are acknowledging that there is a failure in metrics, like relevant Fedora leads, do you feel like this is something that you can take back to the infrastructure group? Because we just have some leads here, but we're not here like make commitments on behalf of the Fedora infrastructure team. We're here to raise stuff. Is this something that we can go back to and raise and address, or is it, does something else need to happen? Kevin, go ahead.
I think metrics are an outstanding idea. I think that would be very good to have. I think they're not going to be as simple as people think, because it is a very complex problem. You can't just say, what is the build latency? Well, the build latency for what? OpenOffice, Chromium, Python 3, requests. They're going to be very different. I think there are things that we definitely can track better, like Fabio mentioned, the time to get allocated resources, as in when the build actually starts. I think that would be a very good metric to have for everything. We are already tracking tons of things in Zabbix. We have all the things that you might expect: CPU, disk I/O, all that stuff is being tracked in Zabbix. But I think the builder-specific, Koji-specific stuff is what we actually need metrics for. And I think Tomasz said he was going to look at filing a ticket or getting some traction on somebody to work on that. So, yeah.
So Tomasz, when you start working on creating that ticket and trying to figure out what kind of metrics to develop, hit me up and we can talk about it, because I did this before. Admittedly, not with Koji, I did it with OBS. I can give you some ideas of what are useful metrics to understand user experience performance. And we can kind of have that conversation from there. I don't necessarily know how to develop the metrics per se, but I can tell you what kind of metrics you should probably be looking for.
Yeah, definitely we'll do that. That's why I was asking for the link for the dashboard. Like, I will use that as a baseline, because some of the numbers are interesting, like time per arch per build. And as Kevin mentioned, it will be a little bit harder problem to group the packages somehow and have an idea what it takes to build, let's say, a platform like Python or thing like Chromium. So yeah, I will definitely hit you up.
Yeah. I did put a link to all the dashboards and other things in the FRCL ticket itself. If you look through the commentary, I do actually link to it. But I also would encourage you, Tomasz, to think about, like, get some inspiration from, like, for example, how do people benchmark PCs for gaming? Because I think a lot of that is latency, input lag, those sorts of things. And the ways they think about those measures are very similar to how we think about this, because it's all about the round trip, right? The round trip for the experience. But we can talk about more of those as details, but I think there is actually a strategy we can use there.
Okay. So I think the thing about metrics is often less is more. If they're just a very small number of things that we add to the measurement, then that's better, because we can actually decide what are we going to do about them. So for me, success in this one, I think, looks like Tomasz does a follow-up. Maybe Kevin talks to other infrastructure folks about this, and we have follow-up take place inside the Fedora community for CLE. So, like, let me take my facilitator hat off and my CLE manager hat on. say from a management perspective, the way I would expect CLE members specifically to work on this, if this is a priority, is for it to show up in sprint planning as a priority for the team that they choose. So that's the plug and play team, which is sysadmins, release engineers, and a couple software engineers. So how that actually breaks down in practice, I'm not sure, but I would expect this to be the sort of thing that the team could choose to prioritize as a thing that they do in one or more sprints. But but that's like doing enablers. As far as policy for how to respond to those metrics, I think that's 100% Fedora community discretion. Does that sound right to everybody? Kevin, does that sound right to you? I hope that sounds right to you.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think you're right about we shouldn't try and make 50 metrics, to make a exhaustive dashboard, blah, blah, blah. We should come up with key metrics that are actually the things that we want to measure, as Neil said, from the contributor point of view, and monitor those, and then be able to try and figure out actions based on those. And yeah, actually, this is definitely something we can plan on and start working on.
Yeah, and I just want to address something in the chat. Neil just mentioned that random community members don't have buying power. I'm not sure most of this is a buying power problem at this point, but I think if we have metrics and we have policy on what to do about those metrics, it can influence people with buying power. Although honestly, at the moment, it's kind of hard to buy anything. Like we are putting in orders and then vendors are canceling those orders because they cannot actually provide the equipment they just quoted to us because they don't have the RAM anymore. So plus or minus that, though, I think most of our problems might be allocations, not whether or not there's enough hardware, just how it's deployed.
I still kind of consider that buying power because from the perspective of, when you're thinking about the of allocations, you're essentially transferring assets around, and that's often represented with dollars in some way, like both in the cost of the equipment, but also the opportunity cost of the transfer, right? So I think from a buying power perspective, it still matters. But yeah, it's not strictly speaking like, let's go to a vendor and go acquire more hardware. But even reallocations count as buying power because you're taking something away from something else and giving it to someone else. And that does translate in budget lines. It translates in assets and all this other fun corporate-y balance sheet stuff that most community people don't care about, but it's your job to care about. So I think it's still worth thinking about it in those terms because otherwise decisions just don't get made about even moving stuff, much less buying new stuff.
Yeah, but it's interesting between allocation and buying. So buying, so maybe outside Red Hat, it looks like that, Neil. But so my perspective is as an insider is buying is like CapEx and quotes and time windows and deliveries and whatnot. Allocation is like, hey, we currently have 10 builders that they're backed by 2 hosts. Maybe we should have 8 builders that are backed by those 2 hosts instead. And that will, in aggregate, make the build times for individual packages go faster. So going back to the 2 stats that are mentioned in the chat, the first being wait time, that feels like just a fundamental thing. Like if we have long wait times, then the suggestion is, for certain architectures, we need to have more builders available, but not ones that are going to slow everything down because that's not going to solve anything. But if we have extra capacity, maybe we add more systems for the architectures where there's a protracted wait time, because there shouldn't be a protracted wait time other than S390, which is how we already know that we need more equipment. But in Yakov's example, where PowerPC is literally 4 times slower than x86 64, maybe we need to beef up those virtual hosts. Can we do that without dropping the wait time? I don't know, but that's something that I would expect to get worked out through the infrastructure team. Although Kevin might have opinions right now.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, as I said, the Power 10 is much better situation than we had with Power 9. But although we are using all the capacity there for the build VMs that we have, and we were talking about ordering another Power 10 to spread out those builders more and decrease some latency later this year. But of course, I have absolutely no idea if IBM is even shipping Power 10s due to the memory, CPU, blah blah blah, supply chain issues. But yeah, certainly we can decrease the number or increase the number of builders, but then they're all smaller. So then you have the larger packages will take longer, but smaller packages will get in faster. It's a balancing act between those two extremes, like between the extreme of having one ginormous builder that can only do one build at a time and 50 really, really tiny builders that can barely do anything at a time. So, but yeah, maybe the metrics will hopefully help figure out where that balancing act is best situated.
Yeah. So I think we can agree that it would be better if build times were on average about the same across the architectures. It would be better if on average we have similar wait times as well. So build time, wait time being comparable is the desired balance we want to get to, right? So I assume that's true.
It at least makes it predictable, right? Like then people can plan and understand how to allocate time to do work.
Yeah, and Chromium is actually, like I said, a really bad example because on x86-64 and ARch-64, we're specifically sending it to build hardware machines that have a lot of CPUs and memory. Whereas on Power, we don't have any of those. They're all build VMs, so it's just going to a build VM. So it's slower in that case. But that's just Chromium. I'm sure we can find tons of other example packages to look at.
Yeah, I mean, and we one thing we don't have is the ability to do dynamic builder VMs, right? Like, so the Koji deployment that exists in Fedora, and I assume internally inside of Red Hat with Brew, doesn't have this feature. This is a feature that exists in the Microsoft Azure instance and in the AWS Amazon Linux instance, but we don't have this capability, which means we can't do things like burst up random capacity VMs just for one build and then free it back up and then allocate lots of smaller builders for different machines. So we always take a huge opportunity cost when we allocate a quote unquote large builder because of that particular problem. Like this is something OBS has. This is something that, again, those cloud provider Koji instances have. We don't have that feature. I have talked to them about this before, and at least Jim from Microsoft was like, yeah, I could try to poke people with sticks to consider contributing that code. So it might be worth talking to them a little harder about like, hey, how your Koji strategies for these kinds of things, can we like make them useful generically for Fedora and things like that. That also can change the way we think about allocations, because if we can have dynamic within the set of fixed builders, then you actually can get to a lot better performance much more easily.
Okay, so Yakov has pointed out we only have 5 minutes left. What are the action items? So I've got 2, and if anybody else has others, please chime in. But the 2 that I believe are coming out of this is Tomasz is going to follow up with Fedora infrastructure and pursue metrics questions, builder time questions. Tomasz, do you have a better way of expressing this?
Oh, I'm just finishing up writing a feature, which will then break down to some meaningful pieces of work.
Okay,
but
awesome.
Yep.
All right. Second one, I'm just making this up on the fly. I would like to suggest that the FESCO members that are on the call start thinking about what are your requirements for RISC-V to get to primary architecture status. Like, what do you need from builders? Like think about this now, because if the answer is it has to be at least as fast as the second slowest system and aggregate build time or average build time or mass rebuild time or something. Like setting that out actually gives the RISC-V team a window to shoot for. It lets them know how many builders they need. It like know what good looks like in a way that can be articulated and that we can do math with, and then we will know what equipment to actually buy, how much of it, and where to deploy it. So, having those thoughts early would be helpful, I think, for the RISC-V effort, and also apparently give you some peace of mind because this is a concern. So those are the two big takeaways. We're already working on the S390 problem, and Josh, I don't think we got any new insights here. Maybe you did, but I think we're going to keep on working there. Were there any other big follow-ups from this? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. Coincidentally, if you're listening to this later, check out the chat because there was an entire second meeting taking place between many people having a sidebar conversation. So next time, let's try to keep it in voice. But meanwhile, a lot of insights there. So last call. Anybody? Anything? All right. Neil, thanks for raising this. I think you have an outstanding insight that we need proactive metrics. I think what did Jeff call them? 1 or 2 quality of life metrics from a user experience are probably what we really want to have. And I think if we do that, we can help us tune how we deploy the systems we get, and help us know that we need to get more systems before it's a point of pain for people. All right, y'all. Let's wrap it up here. I will talk to y'all later. Have a good one.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
See you, folks.